Reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' dead body. Very early, on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb. They were saying to each other, "Who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance for us?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and it was a very large stone. Going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go, tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you." Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Be honest. How many of you have flipped ahead to the end of a book to figure out how it ends before you finish reading it? Or looked up how a movie ends before you watch it? How many of you are perhaps users of, there's a whole website dedicated, it's called Did the Dog Die or Does the Dog Die? Right, to find out in advance whether or not the dog dies in the movie. People love being spoiled, despite all of the time we spend saying spoiler alert or trying to make sure that people don't find out how something ends or who dies or doesn't in a movie before they go and see it for the first time. When we think about some of the most enduring stories in our culture and communities, we know how they end. And yet we keep remaking them and seeing them again and again and again. I was talking to a friend about spoilers, and she said, think about how many people saw the movie Titanic. You know it sinks at the end. Or Romeo and Juliet, a story where we know that they both die. And in fact, even the very first people who ever saw Romeo and Juliet got spoiled because Shakespeare put it in the prologue. He tells you in the first few minutes that you're sitting in your seat or standing in the theater, they both die. And yet, I know for me, when I see productions of it, there's still the sort of audible gasp almost when Juliet wakes up. It's a story that we know how it ends, and yet we read it and watch it and participate in it again and again and again and again. Because the truth is that as human beings, we actually like being spoiled. It's not only that some of us like it and some of us don't, but the majority of us prefer to be spoiled. Even if you think of yourself as someone who likes the surprise. In 2016, UCLA and some social scientists did a study. They looked at how much people enjoyed stories based on whether or not they knew how it ended in advance. And they expected to go in finding that there would be, some types of stories like mysteries or thrillers where people would prefer to know or not know the ending. They assumed, I think like many of us might, with our common sense wisdom, that you would enjoy a mystery more if you don't know who done it. But it turns out that's not true. People rate their enjoyment of stories higher when they know how it ends. And in the interviews about why that's the case, why is it that we prefer to know in advance, people talked about that they could experience the story differently if they knew in advance how it ended. That there is a very noisy part of our brain that's very concerned with outcome. that wants to know who did it. It's what keeps us turning pages in a thriller or a mystery, or keeps us glued to a television series. We're like, yes, we're still watching Netflix. I have to know. That hook keeps us there, but it's so loud that it can make it hard to enjoy the story. We miss details, and our experience of it is actually not as rich when we're so worried about how it ends, and that we prefer the opportunity to turn down the part of our brain concerned with outcome and turn up our experience of the fullness of a story. To notice detail and character and beauty and possibility. All throughout the month of April, we are exploring different lessons about resistance from different religious traditions, about what it means to rise up in different contexts and points in history and around the world. And today, we're looking at what are those resistance lessons that we find in the theology and community and practice of Christianity. What about Christianity can help create powerful movements for justice, and has created powerful movements for justice in our world? And what I want to lift up out of Christianity today and invite us to reflect on is the power of a movement for justice where you know how the story ends. So, like I said earlier, Mark is considered sort of the storytelling gospel. It's the one that's a complete narrative, start to finish. And the original version of it, the oldest written version of it, ends where I ended the reading this morning. It ends with the women who had come to anoint Jesus' body to do a very routine thing after the death of someone in their community, running away scared. And later versions, as the sort of Christian theology developed and the other gospels got written down and people were like, oh, maybe we should make this one agree a little bit more with the others, they started tacking on endings that were more like the other gospels, where you get sort of the full resurrection story where it's like, yes, definitely, it happened, 100% sure. But those are not the original endings. The original ending of the story is the women fleeing. And the last line, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's a gripping end to a story. And one that in some ways sounds like sort of a despair ending. Right? Who wants a story that ends so unhappily? But of course the trick is that the people hearing the story knew that that wasn't how it really ended. Right? Because how could that be how it actually ended if we're hearing the story? Obviously, they told someone, eventually. But the story, the way that early Christians were instructing one another in their faith and sharing the witness of their faith, was to end the story with chaos, fear, uncertainty. And so what happens when you hear a story or experience a story that ends in one way, even though you know it ends a different way, truly, right? That you get to this place in the story, but you, the listener, know that something different happens. You know that there is a sequel to the movie. It's sort of like The Empire Strikes Back, right? Like, you know that Han Solo will not remain in carbonite forever. Like, you know that. You know there's gonna, like, you know that that's not how it ends, but it's arresting when the story ends that way. And that power of what it feels like to have a story that ends differently is part of the theology and community and beliefs and practices that have undergirded one of the most powerful movements for social change in the history of our country, which is the long arc of the movement for Black civil rights, stretching from abolition all the way into contemporary civil rights movements. That an enormous piece of that theology is that they are a community who has a clear shared belief that the story ends a different way, that no matter how much despair or uncertainty or chaos or pain or suffering there is in a given moment, the story ends differently. On a cosmic scale, the story ends differently. And that is enormously powerful and compelled people and allowed them to act courageously for justice in their world in ways that I think many of us really admire. And perhaps have occasionally thought to ourselves, I don't know how they did it. But that's part of how they did it, was that shared commitment that the story ends differently. Maybe not in their lifetime, but that it will end differently. And the theologian and professor Emerson B. Powery, in his commentaries about the Gospel of Mark, talks about how this ending, where everything feels up in the air and unexpected and uncertain, is emblematic of that theological thread in Black Protestant Christianity in the US. That thread that no matter how much suffering there is in the current moment, there's a different ending. And in fact, he talks about the ways that many African American spirituality, or spirituals, right, songs that came out of that tradition, most of the songs are not about the resurrection. Right? They're not the sort of gleeful alleluias that are so popular on Easter. They dwell on the suffering. And it would be easy to think like, well, that's a bit of a downer. How does that give you spiritual fortitude to act courageously in your world? But of course, what gives you the spiritual fortitude is that in that moment of suffering, you know it's not the end of the story. I think about one of the most popular and most prolific, right, in terms of making its way into other Protestant traditions and even Catholic liturgy, is the spiritual "Were you there?" Right? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Which does not end with "Were you there when the resurrection happened?" It ends with "Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?" Were you there when all hope seemed lost? Were you there when nobody knew what was going to happen? When you know that that isn't really the end. It's powerful and powered one of the most profound movements for social change in our country's history. But when we consider what that lesson has to teach us as Unitarian Universalists, we run into the sticking point, if you will, about Easter for Unitarian Universalists, which is that we don't really have quite the same shared sense of how the story ends, at least not on a cosmic scale, right? And it's true, we don't all believe in heaven. Half of our whole shtick, right, the Universalist half of our name, is a rejection of hell in the afterlife. And I would say that the majority of you and us, right, are what I would describe as out to lunch on an afterlife. I think of the shrug emoji as sort of the Unitarian Universalist position on the afterlife. Just like, it's sort of the "your guess is as good as mine" a theology about what happens after we die. And so I have wondered in this moment, thinking about this powerful lesson from Christianity, what is it that we share? What is it that we know about how the story ends that lets us act powerfully and courageously for justice? And there's a couple pieces I think are important to acknowledge that we do share as Unitarian Universalists, because sometimes we get lost in the diversity of our spiritual and theological journeys. We get lost in how different, how plural all of our understandings about life and the universe are, that we forget that there are some things we have in common. And one of them is that we care first and foremost about salvation in this life, about easing human suffering in this life. That whatever hurt there is in this world, that we're not dependent on an afterlife fixing it. We're dependent on working to ease that human suffering right now, in our world today. Right? And another thread is that we believe that we are all connected, that there is a unity in humanity, in its sometimes really just absolutely mind-blowing diversity, that there is a unity, that we are interconnected. We are one. And that it is this life, easing suffering in this life, that matters. And when those two things are true together, it means that if anyone is suffering, that it's in the way of all of our flourishing, and that our call to transform suffering into flourishing, to transform pain into possibility, is because it's affecting us all. And that the pain, the suffering in any one corner of the human family, it's all of our responsibility. That we are not waiting on some cosmic end. We're waiting on one another. And that what you do or don't believe about what happens after we die, or whether or not there's a God, or who Jesus was or wasn't, and whether or not he was resurrected, and what that does or doesn't mean, that all of that is immaterial compared to your willingness to be a partner to transform suffering into flourishing for real people right now, this day, in this world. And that doesn't mean that it's easy. Right? It's easy for me to sort of, with my little notes, and say, yeah, transform suffering into flourishing. It's all good. But the truth is that most of the time, in the effort to transform human suffering into human flourishing, I feel, and perhaps you feel as well, like those women at the tomb. Like the way I thought it was all going to go is not going. And that I find out things about my fellow human beings and about the world that make me astonished, fearful, scared, uncertain. And the Easter story and the lesson from Christianity invites us to know that if we feel that way at any given point in our story, it's okay. That's a normal human response to the state of the world. Running away scared and not wanting to talk to anybody about it, that's a normal human response. That's fine, if that's where you are on this day, or any given day, or at any given moment of a day. But that the story ends a different way. Maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not in any of our lifetimes, but that it does end a different way, that there is a different possibility. I hear it in the words of the hymn that's one of our theme hymns this month. We would be one. That our unity is related to our connectedness, our willingness to work to build a better and different world. The Easter story, told again and again and again, retold, mistold, suddenly remixed with bunnies. Right, that Easter and its story is an invitation to find the beginnings in life's endings, to find possibility, in emptiness, to find life in death, to find hope when we are running scared, knowing that there is a different ending that is possible, a different ending that is what we share, a different ending that is ours to make. What is your part, then? If you let yourself turn down the part of your brain that is constantly wondering, how does this end? That's wondering, right, what's going to happen? If you let yourself turn the volume down on that part of your brain and turn up the part of you that can experience life's fullness, then what part might you play in this story? What beginnings might you find in life's many endings? What flourishing might you find in life's suffering? What's your part? May you find it. Happy Easter. May it be so.